Welcome everyone to the 2024 NATS Chat season, 2024-2025 NATS Chat season, which are once again sponsored by Inside View Press. We are so grateful to Scott McCoy for his ongoing support of our webinar. And I encourage you to go to Inside View Press website to just take a look at the new offerings that are on his page there. He's got a lot of new books. I just noticed a new musical theater book that they've just launched, so you might take a look at that. And for tonight, I am so thrilled to welcome Walt Fritz. Thank you, Walt, for being here tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I'm glad to be the inaugural person for this year. Thanks so much.
You sure are. I can't think of a better way to launch this season, because one of the things that I always so enjoy every time I hear you speak is you really approach all of this from the individual, that we're looking at the whole person. We're not just working on, even from your perspective as a physical therapist, if they come in with hip pain or whatever, right? That it's not just about that. It's that we're treating the individual. And every time I hear you talk about that, I'm struck by the way you articulate that. So I'd like to begin there a little bit. Some of your thoughts about working with the individual and your approach to that.
Yeah, I mean, what you're getting at is that whole concept that each of us tends to look at our clients, our patients, our student, whoever that is, kind of through the paper towel tube, right? The long, skinny version of how we view this person and their problem. As a physical therapist, yeah, I've been around this field for a long time, and I see people acting as if this is a fascial, a connective tissue problem, or a muscle problem, or all these other pathologies, when it's a human problem. It's a human being in front of us. It's not a tissue, even though we like to think it is, because that's how we were trained. And it took me a long time to sort of extract myself from those views, because it's what I learned in school to a certain extent, and it's certainly what I learned in my early training in myofascial release, that no, it's all about the fascia. And to me, it's all about the person. And that's what, over the last 10 or 15 years, my approach, the way I treat patients here in my office, as well as the way I teach this work, has become a more human-based work versus pathology and tissue-based work.
Well, and you talk about, or I was going to say, both of our fields, that's relevant in many fields, almost every field, right? Where we have practitioners, that's relevant. That it's not just about singing, it's about the entire person that comes into our studio to learn about being a singer. And you talk about that clients need to feel listened to and valued, because this helps create a dynamic that will be useful.
I think we could draw a parallel between a traditional biomedical model and possibly the pedagogy model as well, where they're coming in to see us, the expert, and they will most frequently defer to us. They defer to our wisdom, our judgment, our experience, as well as to the hope that we can help them. And that carries a lot of power, and with power can become a lot of potential for abuse. And even if it's not abuse, that disparity in power has always really bothered me, which is why my approach is about sharing power. Shared decision making is really the crux of what I teach and how I teach. People think they're coming to my classes to learn nifty skills about how to fix things in the tissues, which, I certainly hope that they come away with some of that. But what I really hope for is that they get a deeper understanding of shared decision making in all aspects of the biomedical model, as well as the pedagogy model, that it can be sharing. And yes, we have expertise. You sent me in an email yesterday that, somebody's got to watch over the zookeeper. And, I like that, but yet, you know what? I still don't know what this animal in front of me, what's important to them, until I open up the discussion to them and empower them to be able to speak to me without criticism or ridicule or anything like that, which is not an easy thing.
Well, I appreciated your response to that, because there are hot topics, I'm sure, in every field, but in the voice teacher field, we work through different hot topics. And so one of the things the last couple years is the language of student-centered learning and the importance of student-centered learning. But I've heard other colleagues, in fact, I saw a recent post by a very respected colleague about that exact thing. I don't think that was their language, but somebody's got to be in charge of the zoo. They're coming because of our knowledge and experience. They're paying us a lot of money. And whilst I want shared decision making, there is an element of my leading the way because I'm the one that's charging the money and has the experience. So that's where my someone's got to be in charge of the zoo comment came from. I'd love your thoughts a bit more on that.
Well, I can tell you that here in my clinic, I have a physical therapy practice. It's a head to toe pain, primarily pain based, but I get a fair amount of voice patients who are struggling with some voice issues. They've been referred from other people, et cetera. And a lot of them are really taken aback when I ask for so much input from them. And there's almost a question that goes unasked, and once in a while it is asked. It's like, shouldn't you know the answers to these questions? Shouldn't you know what's wrong? Shouldn't you know what to do with me to help me get better? And I basically answer questions like that, and even if they're not asked, I answer them anyway to say, I know a lot. I have a lot of experience in training, et cetera, et cetera. But there's something just so important missing from all of my experience is your experience, is your lived experience. And I think that's what it gets totally dismissed in a lot of medicine as well as pedagogy models where we are the expert. Okay, let's face that. But they're the expert of their lived experience, of their values, their expectations, their fears, their hopes, everything. And I sometimes have to take the lead and be the zookeeper, and I will direct the therapy, but it's not without getting back to them and say, how does this feel to you? Does this feel useful? Does this feel helpful? Does it feel safe? Does it feel like a waste of time? And to me, we're still maintaining why we're being paid good money to do this, but we're also giving them, I think, the courtesy of honoring them as a unique individual, that we need their input to craft the optimal program for them, if you want to call it that.
There's one other thing that you said that I found lovely in our conversation about this approach, and that was you were talking about the different therapeutic models, yet all find ways to reach the student patient. And then you say, such diversity must make one wonder if the magic is in the technique or in the relationship we build. And I love that because I do think a lot of, when I teach practicums, especially for teachers that are working with singers with a vocal injury, I'm like, at that first meeting, you have to have their buy-in to the process so that they're engaged and that they believe in what you are about to do together. You have to have that buy-in. And so that to me has less to do about what all my knowledge is and a lot more to the ability to create a relationship with the client in front of me.
Yeah. Carl Rogers, psychotherapist Carl Rogers, back in 1957, he presented a paper at a conference, which kind of got him ostracized from his profession. And, that's my kind of guy to begin with, because I got ostracized from my myofascial release profession. But what Rogers wrote about was, at the time in 1957, it was viewed that the modality was what created behavioral change. And you had to match the modality with the behavioral disorder. But what Rogers was saying was, it's not the modality, it's our relationship that we build with that person, that the modality matters much less than we think it is. And let's face it, we're still in that problem right now, at least in my physical therapy profession, of looking for a modality that has the answers. And it's like, they've all got them potentially, but what about this person in front of us? And then there's one other person who much newer. It's a speech pathologist out of University of Pittsburgh, Leah Halal, has written extensively. Yeah, Leah has written extensively on metatherapy. And Leah and I had a conversation about my work and her work, because what she recognized with the way I teach manual therapy is, we think it's about the technique, but it's about what surrounds that, what envelops that. Just like in her work, it's not just the technique or the modality or the intervention, it's how we envelop all that the metatherapy becomes, to me, the pivotal part of the work itself.
Okay, I love that. Well, everyone, hang on. We are going to get to exercises, but there were just a few broad concepts that Walt and I wanted to also discuss. The next being touch-based cueing, another hot topic in our field of voice
Yeah.
teaching. It really, in the last decade, I would say, people just are saying don't. Absolutely not. Now, yeah, I can make an argument. I'm an old woman now. I've been teaching 40 years. I can make an argument on both sides of the fence. And again, it really depends on the client in front of us and their comfortability. But one step back from that, making certain that when those decisions are made, whether it's okay with them to touch, that it's not done in the moment at the lesson, that they have time to consider this before they enter into the studio. So that's how it's being handled in a lot of voice studios now. But yeah, I know you have some strong opinions about this touch-based cueing. So I'd love for you to elaborate.
Well, just to make clear my terms, touch-based cueing is something as simple as if we feel that maybe the person is having a really forward head, and we believe that getting their posture aligned might do them better when it comes to voice production, et cetera. Touch-based cueing could be something as simple as, can you tuck your chin back, right? Simple as that, right? We're just touching, and sure, there's a touch-based cue, but it's a cognitive cue to them. And sometimes people see that as a very different mechanism of action. When I'm talking about mechanisms of actions, I'm talking about this long list of things of when we do something, what might it be that creates the change, right? In manual therapy, it's always been about, well, we need to find the tissue that's having a problem and correctly intervene on it in order for the intervention to be successful, right? The magic in my fingers. But and that's how manual therapy, massage, myofascial release, that's how they've been explained for decades, if not longer, that it's what we're doing out here in the periphery, why we need all this training and licensing and everything. And I'm not saying we don't, but when you start taking a look at the new evidence for manual therapy, they're moving the mechanism away from what we think we're doing here, and they're moving it up here to the relationship we're building and the awareness that we're building in the patient, in the client's mind. So instead of it being, okay, I'm breaking something up here for you, maybe it's I'm giving a slight little cue out here for you to do some of the heavy lifting on your own. So my whole point with all of this is, even though this, which is a touch-based cueing, might seem entirely different from me doing the exact same thing, but holding it for 5 minutes because I think I'm reorganizing tissues. The new literature really says maybe there's not the divide that we think there is. And I'm not giving anybody or telling anybody it's okay to touch when it's not. I'm not saying it's okay to believe you're doing things that you're not or telling your clients. But if you have the ability to touch, that realize that your mechanisms may not be that dissimilar from my mechanisms.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's move. Is there anything else around the touch? But I know we're going to talk about the boundary when we do the thoracic, because I thought that was so fascinating when we do some of that movement. But anything else that you wanted to delve into? You feel
well, okay. So everybody, I posted a ridiculously long, continuous paragraph in the chat. That's going to be shared on the YouTube, or where's it going to be, Kari?
Yes, when we post it on YouTube, the link to this webinar, we'll have that in there.
Yeah, so don't bother trying to work your way through my hieroglyphics there. But I just did a little bit of Googling last night about looking at how someone like me can affect singers, okay? And you read things like, and I'm just going to go down the list really, really quickly: self-myofascial release stretching, improving vocal performance; Feldenkrais and the singer; yoga and the singer; improving posture in the singer; manual therapy to the diaphragm; warm up and cool down; the psoas major. Psoas is a hot topic; pelvic floor, etc. Of course, manual therapy for dysphonia; kinesiotaping over the top of the skin; stretching and Pilates; breathing exercises; Alexander technique. There's all this incredible evidence out there, whether it's in book form or studies, that shows that when somebody did one of those excuse me, dozen or so things that I just mentioned, that the person had improved voice quality or performance or whatever that might be. And that gets really almost overwhelming at times. Well, wait a minute, do I need to look for the right person to apply Alexander with versus laryngeal manipulation? And, I don't think such studies exist, number one, but what all of those instances, as well as the studies that are linked to that, says that maybe it matters less that what we're doing, it's the fact that we're doing, right? All of those interventions are building relationships. Ideally, they're building relationships and not just, tranquilizing the patient and doing what we think is necessary to them. And to me, okay, so this is about stretching. At least that's what we talked about. And if somebody is looking for the routine, it's not out there. You're going to find everybody's got a different opinion. And oddly enough, everybody believes it's the best, which to me says there's no such thing. Like we're going to apply something, but in my view, instead of me saying to you, Kari, here's what I think we should do, I'd rather say, Kari, here's what we might do. Well, let's try a little bit, see if you resonate with it. And whether it's me sticking in my silo of manual therapy, the way I do it, not just do it based on the muscle orientation, but I do it based on your orientation. Does this feel useful to you? And I think those points apply to all of those different techniques, all of those different interventions. And, if you start polling people as experts in each of their field, you'll probably get some disagreement, but there's nothing better than a good fight like that on Facebook to keep things lively, right? It's what it's about. There is no such thing as the gold standard for any of these works. So find something you're comfortable with. If touch-based cueing is something that you are able to avail yourself of, maybe you can realize that you are reaching more than that sense of, oh, you touched him here, because you're also touching him here. You're creating a loop of awareness and understanding that the feedback from voice change is the feedback you're looking for when you give them that cueing.
I love that. The idea too of some of it is simply about enabling them to explore their own experience, right? To explore in their body. Maybe there's somebody that's so busy or they don't really take time to sit and breathe and feel how things work. And so it might be that more than a specific modality. Is that what I'm hearing you?
Yeah, it is. And it's exactly what it is. Now, I don't know how it is in the voice world, but I know if there's any speech pathologist in the group watching or on the tape, protocols are king. Protocols are what some view as embodiment of the evidence-based model. And by the way, I love your evidence-based voice model with the paper that you shared from me. But certainly we need protocols in order to conduct a proper study. You can't be doing totally different things on every person, right? We have to narrow it in and say, okay, we're going to do 5 minutes of this, then we're going to do 5 minutes of that, and however that works. But there's massive amounts missing from those protocols because you're not giving your client, your patient, whatever you call them, a chance to give you feedback. And I work from a very loose protocol. I know the studies, I know the protocols, and I sample from them. And my bias is towards things I've been doing for years. But like you, I've been in the field for 40 years, and I guess we do that, right? But if you can realize that maybe the protocol isn't what creates the change, the protocol just created the study, which gives us permission. Because if you look at the evidence-based model, it's not about rigidly following the protocol. It's about modifying and adapting the evidence to meet the individual needs of your end user. And one more thing, and then I'll let you go on, Kari, because one of the things in physical therapy and manual therapy, and I think to a certain extent in speech pathology, that the evidence-based model is 3 circles. That's how it was formed. 3 equally weighted, or it's a triangle, however they want to diagram it, right? One is the evidence, the research. One is clinicians' experience interpreting that and applying it, right? And the third one is patient preferences and values. And I look at how I used to do physical therapy, whether it's exercise-based or manual therapy-based, and I really shake my head and it's like, how did I con myself into thinking that I was giving that person in my chair or on my table an equal weighting with what I thought was important to them? So basically, in respect for the original evidence-based model, and it's still the same model, let's figure out ways that we can elevate that client's participation. And there's nothing more honoring of that to me than shared decision making.
Love that. So let's move on to evidence just for a moment on our way to get to the exercises here in just a couple minutes. I love that you wrote, evidence should underpin everything we do, because I believe that in the singing field as well. Of course, a lot of that evidence can also come from, as we just talked about, our own lived experience as teachers, right? That especially in the singing community, the practice-based evidence is really critical as well. But are there any research, like what is the physical therapy research specifically with singers? Is there much focused just on singers?
You'll find a small subset of evidence in the physical therapy journals relating to performance, singers in specific, breathing, that sort of thing, as well as actors and musicians. Yes, you will find some. It's a pretty small group.
Okay.
Honestly, Kari, I look at it and I see the same problems I see in the more general physical therapy literature, right?
Okay.
They're still talking about a person's problem as being they're too weak, they need to get stronger. They're too tight, they need to get looser. And those are the simple stories that patients, clients love, right? Oh, yep, you know, the PT said I was too weak and I need to strengthen my core. It's basically accepted fact now that core stability is what's necessary, core strength. But I also like counterculture papers. A colleague of mine wrote a paper called The Myth of Core Stability, A.L. Lederman out of the UK. And it really questions what we've been taught for decades now about strengthen your core, because what you do is you get a lot of people walking around constantly flexed, tight, out of fear that if they loosen their core, somehow their back is just going to explode on them. And I think the same problems exist within the literature that physical therapists have done when it comes to research with singers. I'm not trying to dismiss it or belittle it, but we're all looking at the world through this really small, you know, tube, instead of opening up and saying, you know, exercise is helpful, but it does a lot more than just strengthen a muscle, right? Manual therapy, stretching, self-applied stretching, does a lot of really good things, and it's so much more than making a muscle actually longer, which is actually one of the things that has been poorly shown that it does. The evidence for stretching, I was trying to pull some up, I kind of forgot at the last minute. The evidence for stretching, there's a fair amount that says that it's not necessary when it comes to physical performance, right? Or at least not the old static ones, right? But there's a whole new movement to say, if you as an individual feel that stretching feels good and might help you, then you should be doing stretching, versus us saying everybody should stretch. Exactly, right?
And to what degree and to how long, for how long. I love that you said on that webinar, because I have some stretches in my book, and I remember asking people that I thought would know, well, how long should they do that? And they're like, oh, you know, and it sounds like they're
it's all over the place, from some models that are literally a 2-second stretch to, I learned, 5 minutes or longer. That you're not tapping into a certain aspect of the fascia unless you hold it for 5 minutes. And none of it's been proven. Most of it's been debunked, but people still they just love those simple stories. And we get so caught up in the model that we were trained in that we feel like that's truth. And it's just, they're just opinions.
Well, as we move into stretches, I want to just quote you again. This is a Walt Fritz quote. I don't stretch to get a muscle longer or strengthen to simply gains strength. My underlying motivation is to build awareness, self-awareness. This is my underlying intent. And I love that from a physical therapist. When you give an exercise, what I'm reading in that is just what you were saying. It's not just to stretch or just to stretch or just to strengthen. It's about an awareness of the movements and how that informs the client.
Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with wanting to get stronger. And there are certainly injuries and in illnesses, et cetera, where the person is deconditioned and really needs to get stronger. But the thought that, I keep going back to back pain, that someone is having back pain because they're weak, it's so myopic. But yet the weird thing is, they do exercises, they get stronger and their back feels better. So it's almost like that post hoc fallacy that we feel that, oh, that must have been it. I feel better because I did the exercises and now I'm stronger. But the effects of exercise are so multifactorial. And that's a really hard one. Okay, so quickly, we're going to talk about the tongue in a little bit, but we do a maneuver in my introductory class where we do some tongue stretching, right? But then we also do some resistive work with the tongue. And what's so cool about this, the concept of weakness to strength, right? We need to do exercises to get stronger. If you're following a true weakness model, then that takes days, if not weeks, to build strength in a muscle, because you have to work it to fatigue, allow it to rest, and then you need to train it again and again, and you add resistance, right? That's traditional strengthening. But there's times when we're working with a person's tongue, and we put some pressure down on it, and we ask them to resist, and they're very weak. They can't do it. And all I do is give a little bit of input, and that's tapping my finger on the part of the tongue that's not responding. And it's like this loop that goes from peripheral to central, and the brain says, oh, I know how to do that. And you come back down and boom, they can access that part of their tongue and have what somebody might say is better strength. It's not because the muscle got stronger all of a sudden. It's the brain became able to delineate, what is it this person is asking me? Oh, I get it. And instantaneously the change happens. So that's sometimes the kind of strengthening or the kind of work I use with exercise. Sure, some people do need to get stronger, but it's also about building that sensory motor awareness.
Well, speaking of sensory motor awareness, let's jump into the thoracic one that I just thought was so interesting on the webinar I watched you give, mostly because it wasn't about a specific breath mechanics for singers. It was like embodied what we've been talking about, awareness. So will you walk us through what you were?
Yeah, you put a lot of pressure on me to try and remember what I said. Like
I can help because I just watched it.
That's okay. I'm just going to kind of stand up and so before we start this, right? These are self stretches we're talking about right now. They certainly could be good for your own benefit. And depending on your scope of practice, your allowability within your individual professions, whether or not you could put hand over hand with them or do this with your client, those are things that you need to work out. There's my little disclaimer there, right? I personally, when I'm working with a client, I used to think I always had to be right on the skin, but I no longer believe that at all. In fact, I would much rather work over their hand so that they don't get any sense that, what's this guy doing? Is this safe? Is there something else at play here? But by allowing their hand over the body part that we're working with, so they have a locus of control, and with permission, I put a hand over them. What that does, it gives them, first of all, a chance to resist me if they think, for instance, it might hurt or it might feel inappropriate or whatever, right? But then it gives them not only the idea of what we're doing, but how easy it is for them to do it themselves. And that's really my take home from teaching home stretching like this and seeing clients here in my office is, I want to make myself expendable. If I can teach them how to do this, right, then they don't need me, or maybe we can move on to other things, all right? So I'm gonna get my head out of the picture and bring my thorax in for a moment. I'm kind of overdressed here. It's a little cold today in upstate New York. So, so diaphragm, right? Okay, treat the diaphragm.
Sorry, what did you say?
Treat the diaphragm. Can you do an exercise? Can you do a stretch? Can you do an interaction which isolates the diaphragm as the sole recipient of that intervention?
I'm going to say
yeah, because my annoying response to that is, not without a scalpel you can, right?
Yeah.
Because in my field, people talk about it, oh, your masseter's in spasm, we need to break up that spasm. But again, without a scalpel, you cannot isolate that masseter. You're working through awareness, their nervous system, etc. All right. So we're working the general region of the diaphragm, but without a scalpel, which I don't think anybody here is licensed to use, we can't treat the diaphragm in isolation, right? So one of my favorite diaphragm region intervention is basically, I'm just going to make myself some room here. I kind of like to use this sort of approach here, where I'll come in. I'm very fond of using this part of my hand right here, where I'll come in to just above or just at the lower part of the sternum, you can kind of choose where you want to be. Rather than me saying, here's exactly where you should put your hands, here's where shared decision making comes in. Because I can say, put it here, but you might feel, oh, I like that better down here. But what happens if you gently compress inward and then do a little bit of a downward pull, right? And then try and take a deep breath with that. Or as you try and inhale, hold down. What happens if you pull down and begin leaning backward? Kari, you asked me about doing the cobra. Well, I'm not going to be able to get down on the floor here, right? But can you envision the stretch that happens when you're down on the floor in full cobra? And by the way, I'm a bigger fan of Sphinx rather than cobra, because most people really, cobra is, if you know what cobra is, where you go down on your belly, you come up on your extended arms, and you can hold it for about 30 seconds, right? We'll do things like that for back pain, all these sorts of things, right? But most people can't tolerate it. But Sphinx is where you come on your elbows. And to me, that hits a nice sweet spot between nothing and too much, right? But if you moved into, whether you're on the floor or in a position like this, let me tuck my belly in so it doesn't look so big there. There we go. So, and do that downward stretch, right? But then start to open up. Open up, lean back. And you could do it totally resting, totally passive, and let the stretch seem to be the work. Or you can incorporate breath. You can incorporate breathing. You can incorporate voice, anything like that, while you're holding that stretch. There's other things that we can do here, and it could be something as simple as, well, what happens when we do some side bending? What happens when we stretch down with side bending? What happens when we add in rotation, right? So I like this one in sitting better, but if I'm with my pelvis is stabilized and I'm twisting my torso, what happens if I give a little bit of resistance to the ribs, the intercostals, and by association, the diaphragm as well? A lot of people, when they think of stretching, they think of sorry about that. And by the way, this one is real. This was gifted to me by a client a couple years ago, and it's a real skeleton. It's so fascinating, but that's a whole nother. Yeah. A lot of times people say, well, what are the best stretches for whatever we're talking about? And, I kind of give them a little bit. I'll say, you might want to try this one, but what about if we start a stretch and then allow you to go free form to say, can you get yourself to a place that while you're applying that stretch, maybe it's in an area where you fatigue at the end of a performance. In a runner, that might be a rib stitch. In a singer, that could be the place where they really just fatigue, cramp, or things fail, right? What happens if you move into that space and then start to three-dimensionally move a bit until you can isolate that feeling? Or maybe it needs to be combined with voice, etc. All right. I love things like that. When I prescribe stretches, they're very freeform. Here's where we're going to start, but where do we need to take it? Can I give you one quick example, and then I know you're ready to move on, but when I
No,
people,
I'm not. I have a couple questions too.
Because, and I don't mean to pick on any other kind of modality, but if somebody is a yoga practitioner, it's all about form. It's all about getting everything in symmetry, etc. Because if you don't, then I don't know the yoga narrative, right? But a lot of times when you go into Cobra or Sphinx, it's supposed to be good for the low back, the hip flexors, the psoas, etc. But yet there's something up here that doesn't quite make it because it didn't connect me with my issue. So what I'll ask somebody to do is to go into Sphinx or Cobra and then get sloppy. Break the rules. The things that your yoga teacher might say, no, you need to get back into form. But what if you allow form to be the place that takes you to a connection to your issue? And that is the crux of my approach. I want to make my patient, my client, my student feel connected, that whatever we're doing, whether it's me doing the work or them doing the work or us doing the work, that we created a felt sense connection to their issue. So when you're doing stretches for breathing, you could do them as these are what we do for breathing, or you can modify them and say, well, here's what we often do, but what if you experimented a bit? Where do you need to go to take yourself to a place where it becomes meaningful to you?
Hmm. And well, if you when you were doing this way, are you still stretching down, in that,
You
or
could,
just
right? I could be pushing down. I could be pulling up, right? I could be
okay,
giving myself a little bit of that as well. Um,
okay. It just
you know,
depends on what they want, what they feel like
yeah.
their body needs. Okay. I love that.
And again, when we get in these pseudo therapeutic settings, it feels like, well, I need to know what I'm doing before I teach them stretching. But yet, we all get out of bed in the morning. We go, we do all those three-dimensional contortions because they feel good, right? We go to those places where, oh, I'm really tight there. I think I'm going to hold that stretch for a little longer. And that's exactly the way I teach stretching versus here's the 10 basic things you need to do every day.
Mm-hmm.
I like to say, how about if you take those 10 and then you individualize them for yourself?
Hmm. Well, and I think that's such a great way that as they enter the studio and they're transitioning from wherever they are for the day,
Yeah.
driving to the lesson or wherever, and it gets them centered not just on the larynx and where we're going to sing, right, but the whole body and just that mind-body connection. So I think that's wonderful. You also, I remember when I heard you talk about that one specifically, you said, listen, it's not like we walk around on stage like this.
Yeah.
So learning to sing while doing some different gestures can be so useful.
And, okay, so we talk about posture, right? You need to get your posture optimal. Well, a lot of times that there's almost a rigidity with posture where if I leave this posture, then I'm not in good posture, right? But yet you have to leave that posture. There's no such thing as being able to maintain a posture. And that's
Mhm.
where some of the posture police things get really overplayed, I think. Yes, improving head alignment, neck alignment does improve voice. Same thing with diaphragm and pelvis, etc. But we got to make sure that the client realizes that I don't expect you to stay in that. Realize that you have some volitional control over those things. And maybe you need to at times remind yourself, almost give yourself that touch-based cueing. Okay. But there's a lot of performers who have
Mhm.
really crappy posture, but they're world class, right?
Right.
And to me, it's like that list that I shared in the chat that just became one long thing. Sure, there's studies out there that show that changing posture helps voice, but there's a lot of people who don't pay any attention to posture and do really, really well.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, let's move on to my favorite Walt Fritz one that I stole a
Wow.
year ago from your PAVA presentation that I have had tremendous results with, you call it laryngeal anchoring. So that's what I will be calling it in my second edition when it's included.
Okay.
And let me just let what I recall about your presentation is that you take your fingers right in front on the thyroid notch area and you are stretching the skin
A little bit
down.
lower. A little bit lower. Yep. Yep.
You start a little bit low because I'm on my thyroid notch here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really a pretty small space between your thyroid notch and the sternal notch, which is the top there. And you can,
Okay.
what, right? Uh, and
Go
you're spot on perfect, right? But what it should be is not a slide or a glide. You're
okay.
trying to grab hold of the skin
Skin.
and you're pulling downward. Now, as I get older, I have more skin to pull down, okay? So I sometimes have to take a couple of grips on it, right? But what's interesting is this was an adaptation of something I learned decades ago for a totally different reason, not done in this way. But as I started teaching this work for voice and swallowing, I started creeping up here. And I noticed that when we did this, and basically what we're doing is we're anchoring the larynx in a downward position, right? At first, and I mentioned this to you, Kari, I think, that when we first did this, it was primarily for swallowing, all right? For swallowing disorders, because what you're creating is an effortful swallow, right? Because the larynx has to rise quick and extreme in order to accomplish that swallow. So by anchoring the larynx down, you're giving resistance. One might
Mm-hmm.
say you're strengthening it. Another person might say you're stretching it. I say you're building awareness, right? But then
Okay.
what I loved about this, Kari, that you gave me feedback that I hadn't gotten before, because when I taught this, I said, this is primarily for swallowing. And you said, you know what? Ever since you did that PAVA year ago, I've been using it with my students and it's worked really well. It's like, that's so wonderful to hear, right? Because obviously we need the larynx to rise with pitch glides, et cetera, right?
That's right.
But there's ways to work around it with voice that you can't work around with swallowing. So I really hadn't processed that much. But to give you the how-to of this, if you took, and when I teach it, I like to use just these fingers. Not that you
Okay.
have to do it this way, right? But it creates it, it's a little easier to see, right? So the thyroid notch is the Adam's apple. If
Right.
you're, women of smaller thyroid notch, right? I'm putting my third and fourth fingertips just below the thyroid notch. And then what I do with these fingers is I just rest them right over the top. There's very little posterior pressure. If you have any kind of lotion or makeup, it really doesn't work really well with that. But sometimes you can use a t-shirt, pull through the t-shirt. We use Dyson, which is the sticky product that works really well. But if you could just take that skin and pull it downward. Now you can hear already how it's affecting my voice. I don't know if you can hear through that, right? Now, what I'm gonna ask you to do is let's go to the old place first. As you anchor your larynx down, I want you to just try a very shallow swallow. Now, most people say, oh, that kind of hurt, or that was difficult. I had a lot of effort, it took a lot of effort. Some people said I couldn't swallow with anchoring it, right? So if you use that as an intervention, a stretch, you could help that person improve their swallowing. But the same applies to the larynx. If we held it down and we had them go through, it could just be, let's just stretch for a while. Or it could be a stretch combined with vocalizations. Because what you're doing, if you can figure out a way in your own inner awareness, that sensory motor experience, if you can figure out a way to overcome it with resistance, when you take the resistance away, it often feels like it's gliding. It's so much less effortful to do that. And
So
I'm really pleased that you really caught on to that one so well too, Kari.
well, and I'm going to give you a little preamble, and there will be a question. What's fascinating to me about this is I have I work with a lot of advanced singers, both in classical and contemporary. And what's so interesting to me is that when I've chosen to go there, it's because I hear something in the sound that sounds like I want a little more depth. I'm not even going to say warmth. And I'm not even going to say that the larynx was elevating in a negative way. There's just something in the sound. And every single person I've used that on, regardless of genre, has had a profound response. I have a singer who's been with me 12 years. She's a fantastic teacher and a phenomenal contemporary singer with an easy high belt up to F and beyond. And I recently I don't generally use this with her because she doesn't need it, but we were trying to get a little more depth in the sound. I thought she was getting a little too And we used that on her, and even her at that high level of singing, she was like, well, why haven't you given me this one before? That was extraordinary. There was something different in that. And I have to tell you, as I reverse engineer things while exercises, I was thinking, okay, with a contemporary aesthetic, we know that we want a larynx that's neutral, neutral high. Classical, we want neutral, neutral low. So I'm surprised that that's working with a variety of aesthetics. But what I've decided is, and I love this idea, I think I stole this from you as well, that we can give a task or a tool to our singers and the body will reorganize itself for efficiency. The body wants to reorganize itself for efficiency. And I've just stolen that and used that for the last year, and people have really responded to that. So the question of that preamble is, and this may not be in your scope, why would that work with a client where we want a neutral higher larynx for a contemporary aesthetic, but they're getting a result that helps them feel better as well? And that's interesting.
So this is a question I posed for the last 10 years that I'm still waiting for the study that says that through X-ray or sonography, that sort of thing, that we can actually create a permanent change in the resting height of the larynx. I have asked that question at every class I've taught, and I've always gotten a blank stare. I did a workshop at Voice Foundations this past year, and there was someone in the audience who said, we did a study on that. And she said she'd send me the paper, and it's not been sent, and I don't know who it was. I apologize. Anyway, I'm still waiting for that. So when you talk about that, are you truly talking about where it actually sits if we looked at it on an X-ray, or are you talking about now this is more your realm and definitely not my realm, but the thought that certain kinds of singing require the larynx to be medium, high, etc. And because in my cynical, simple mind, I'm just viewing when we do these things, we're giving our client the ability to have better control over where they want to go versus this somewhat myopic view that no, your larynx is too high or too low. You see where I'm going with that?
I do. And I'll just add, Joan later, my sweet friend, just put in the question box to help answer my question. She says, laryngeal anchoring will give you depth because it makes people aware that the instrument is inside. It creates so much space and the student will refrain from pushing. So I love that.
Yeah. I like that too. And
yeah.
what in my words, it's like if I can do that, whether it's a swallow or get to that place with resistance, when you take the resistance away, it's like losing 30 pounds, right? Oh, I feel like I can walk or sing or move easier.
Well, let's move on. So thank you for that, Walt. I will be forever grateful because my students have had such a positive response to that.
That's so wonderful to hear. Yep.
Yeah. Articulation. A jaw stretch. Go ahead.
Hang on 1 second. I'm just looking at the question there. Are they singing while stretching or after? And to me, the answer is yes.
Oh, I didn't get that. I don't see that question.
Yeah, no. And the answer is yes, try both. You can try it as just a stretch, or you can have them do it while you're stretching. That's where people look for, okay, what's the proper protocol? And the proper protocol is you figure it out with the individual in front of you. Some might benefit from doing the stretching or the exercises first and then applying the task you're trying to improve. I would much prefer they're involved with the task because I want them to feel that sense of, oh, right here, I can feel that you're connecting with that problem that I have. That's my preference. But it's not like they have to continue to sing or do whatever it is we're working with continuously. A lot of times it's just, okay, go back in and test it now while either I'm holding the stretch or while you're holding the stretch on yourself.
I absolutely do it. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I absolutely do it while they're singing. And that's why I was saying I was surprised that both classical singers, while they're singing, that makes sense that it would help them. But it surprised me with the musical theater. It hasn't really surprised me, but I just always want to think through these exercises. So I'll have them take their hardest phrases, and that's when we'll do it. And so whilst they're singing is when I do it. Let's move to the jaw. You talk about doing one where you just open the jaw to the max. Can you demonstrate that and talk about that?
Yeah. So stretching, how hard should you stretch? How hard should you push? Those are unanswerable because some people push hard and some people don't push hard at all. But I'm going to be using something like this with somebody with jaw tension, jaw pain, jaw cramping. We certainly want to be mindful of the red flags of a TMJ disorder, things like that. But if we're talking about somebody with some jaw complaints, not taking the jaw and pulling it down and opening it. I happen to have my little friend here, right? Not pulling it down as much as possible, right? But what if you took the chin, and again, whether it's you taking their chin or asking them to take their chin, right? What if they took like that and just held it and say, I want to open it to a place that feels comfortable, not where you feel pain. But here's a problem, because I'm guessing this applies in the singing world like it does in the physical therapy world. There are people who walk in my door who feel that if it's not hurting, it's not helping, that it has to hurt to help. And there's the other end of the spectrum who say, if it's hurting, I shouldn't be doing this, right? So there's a lot of the therapeutic relationship needs to be built here. How hard do you need to push in order to begin to connect with a person's sense of awareness? Not in order to create change in the muscle, but this is the hard part of this work. Who are you as an individual? How much force, how aggressive, or how far should we go until you feel like we're doing something? I love those bare basic words. Does it feel like we're doing something? And if not, what if we push a little further, right? What if we push a little less? What if I held, or you held, and you then tried to close your mouth against resistance? Now, when we're doing it ourselves, it's not the same as when somebody is doing to us or with us, right? And here's where the boundaries come in. And what I will do is I will apply that small amount of resistance and gently have them resist. And I might do the opposite. I might hold under here and say, now try and open your mouth against my resistance. Are we trying to get that mouth to open up like this thing does? No. I'm trying to get them, number one, to get over that sense of jaw tension. And I want to move that jaw in a way until they say, yeah, that's that feeling I get right there. And that's the magic in this work to me, whether we're working the diaphragm region or the tongue or whatever, is it's not just doing a stretch or an exercise, but it's doing it where they begin to, it resonates with them, all right? Now, we certainly have a lot of other things that we do for jaw tension, for jaw pain, that sort of thing, which are more out of the scope for this talk because we go inside the mouth, right? But simple things like that. By the way, a lot of your clients, a lot of my clients, they don't like this simple story that we just need to build awareness. They want to hear, your muscle's tight, we need to stretch it. Your muscle's weak, we need to strengthen it. So I can be a bit of a hypocrite at times. And depending on their narrative, on their belief system, if they walk into my office and say, you know, my jaw is so weak, I can't maintain this for an entire performance, then I will talk. I'll put on a different hat, a bit of a chameleon, and I'll talk in terms of strength or in stretching, that sort of thing. I'm not lying to them, but I'm sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit to meet their narrative based on shared decision making and trying to build that therapeutic relationship.
Love that. Thank you. Let's move to tongue. And I'm going to, in my studio, we call these finger puppets. I love my little finger puppets. I get them on Amazon. You don't type in finger puppets on Amazon, type in finger gauze. I don't know why I call them finger puppets, but I have one question before you show maybe one or two stretches. One of the ways I've liked to use this is to stretch it out, put it under the tongue, wrap so that my finger is touching the gauze, and then let the tongue go back inside the mouth back to a neutral resting position, and then explore from there. But so that's been one fun way. But one of the questions I have for you is, when we do a stretch, whether it be straight out or with my finger and thumb in the gauze, does it matter if I go down towards, out that way or straight out? Can you talk to me about that a little bit?
Yeah. So there are people who say, no, you need to do all the cardinal planes. And what I tend to do is I have a routine of about 5 or 6 different maneuvers that we do in the class where it basically checks all the planes. Some of it is pulling it down or out. I got to be careful going up because of the frenulum, right? But then we do lateralization, we do elevation, we do compression down into the floor of the mouth. Does it matter? No, it doesn't matter. You got to figure out what matters to the person, right? You want to take, again, if you pull it down and they say, I'm not quite feeling that, well, how about if you pulled your tongue slightly outward or laterally, right? I also like, I'm going to demo with this because I can't talk and do it at the same time. I'm going to take you through a quickie here, right? I'm going to hold this up so you can see a little better, right? Because we'll start off with something like a basic, let's just pull outward, right? We're pulling that way. We do something which I'm not going to share on a national audience what I call this technique, but we take the tongue and we roll it where I anchor it down and I lift at the back. That's a very different engagement of the intrinsic and extrinsic musculature of the tongue, where you get a lot of elevation up from the hyoid and the larynx, okay? We do, I got to get my finger in here, we do a lateralization, where I'll come in on the sides of the tongue, and I will gently squeeze and pull, or I'll do a little bit of what I call hooking, all right?
So you're squeezing. Well, is there a difference between squeezing it, holding it flat, and stretching, or are these just all things to explore?
They're all things to explore. Is there a difference? Possibly no, possibly massive, which is why I like to do more than just, so when I learned tongue pulls back in the early 90s, it was top, bottom, pull. And pull became something that, well, people would really pull hard. And over the last 40, 30 years of doing this work, 35, et cetera, I've gone from pulling fairly strongly, right, pulling that sucker, to many times when I'm going to put on my hat as a physical therapist for a second. Many times now, when I take a hold of a person's tongue in any of those maneuvers and some other ones that we do too, the first thing I do is nothing. I just hold their tongue.
Yeah.
What's so fascinating, Kari, is after a minute, not even a minute sometimes, somebody will give me the sign to let go. And they'll say, that's really strange. You weren't really pulling, but it was almost too much. And I look at what I did all those years when I was really yanking that
Oh
sucker,
my
right?
gosh.
And I wonder, okay, so first of all, they were on guard. They weren't really feeling, they were just, okay, pull it, okay, do what you think is necessary, right?
Right.
They were allowing me to be the expert. Now I do it so much softly. Sometimes just taking a hold of your tongue and holding it can become impactful. You'll start to feel the tension, feel the fatigue, feel the places that don't seem to have that motor response that you're looking for. Eventually, you may start to engage. But when I start to engage, I go from doing nothing, and then it's about doing, not yanking it, but just taking the mildest bit of tension. And then, if you would like more, then we'll give more, all right? But I think that's probably the biggest take home of any kind of tongue stretches, whether you're doing it yourself or teaching it to one of your clients, is this is not about making that muscle longer. I could talk on for a long time about the old thought of what happens when we stretch a muscle somehow got longer. It doesn't happen at the local level. It happens at the central level, all right? I don't care that you can stick your tongue out farther. I care that your articulation is improved, that your fatigue or pain is less, that your swallowing is improved, because swallowing is a mandatory, you need mandatory input from the tongue, etc. All right. So whether you're doing, any of those, start very, very gently. There is enough research out there to show that self-stretch or self-touch is a different experience than applied touch, social touch, social, right? And I, again, I'm not going to get into it here, but it's not to say a self-stretch can't be effective, but there's something that happens when someone else touches you that creates a very different experience. Number one, they don't know what to expect. So a different part of the brain, the attentive centers of the brain open up in a way that doesn't happen when we do self-touch, right? I don't want to make it discourage you from teaching self-stretching, because that's basically what we're talking about here in this talk today. But realize that sometimes stretch, touch applied by someone else can be impactful in different ways.
Okay. That's interesting. And I can see that to be true, but I have to say in my studio, especially working in the rehabilitative vein, I never touch my clients. I would never take their tongue and do that. I teach them, I walk them through it, and they all notice a profound difference. So I'm just going to have to call that a win, because I'm not willing to cross that boundary. But that's very.
And Kari, I did not mean to say that don't do it because it's not as effective. Right?
No, I hear that.
I think maybe we could use the word it's differently effective. It has the potential to be differently effective.
I love that. I appreciate that. I'd love to see that article too.
Yeah.
Well, I know you are all over the world teaching your workshops, your courses on a lot of this. And so people can just go to your website. Yes. And is it, I just get your newsletters and keep up with you there and on Facebook. So people can do that. There we go.
Sure.
WaltFritz.com.
If I could spell, wait a minute, I didn't spell my name right. Sorry. WaltFritz.com.
That's okay.
Yeah, just go to WaltFritz.com. It's got, I teach in-person seminars around the world, but I also have online courses. I actually get a fair number of voice coaches coming to my classes for their own information, for their own understanding. And I don't at all encourage people to act out of their scope of practice, et cetera. Everybody needs to stay in their lane, as we say, right? But there is information out there. And I learned so much information from people that are totally unrelated to what I do. Like I talked about that Carl Rogers study earlier. I love research outside of my world, out of my PT or SLP, to who I work with a lot with the classes. I learned so much from them about what happens when we interact with a human, not with a tissue. And I think that's one of my big take homes, is we are working with a human being and not poor posture, not weak muscles, etc.
Well, and as teachers of singing and singers ourselves, we are voice athletes. So we certainly don't have the depth of knowledge that a physical therapist would about, the physiology and the muscles and the interconnectedness. I mean, some people might have gone and done deep study, and so I don't mean to put a broad stroke on that, but it's certainly our training involves many other aspects of it. So
And I will
Yes,
just say,
thank
if
you.
you're,
You read my mind.
so I'm going to be 65 in another month and a half, and I finally got a research paper published. Yay for Walt. But this is about taking a look at the mechanism of action for laryngeal manual therapies and the need for an update. Even if you're not doing laryngeal manual therapies, I think you might find this interesting based on the mechanism of actions that I talked about earlier in our talk today, that it's not just about you need to release this tension right here at the local level. It really doesn't happen that way. It happens up here. Okay, and that's what I talk about a lot in this it's a pretty short paper and pretty easy to get through if you're interested. And if you can't get a copy of it, what's that?
Yeah, if you send it to me, do we have permission to attach it on the YouTube? I was going to ask you for it.
Yep.
You also
Yep.
have a book, in case people are wondering, is it handy? Yeah, manual therapy for voice and swallowing. So I'm sure a lot of what you teach in your course can be found in that book as well, but just not the hands-on with you teaching it.
Yeah, and also the thing that I'm really honored. I was asked to contribute to the upcoming Oxford Handbook of Vocal Pedagogy. That I'm, along with Maria Gilman and Mark Molotaro, we put together a chapter on body work and its influence on voice. And to me, that was a real honor to be asked to contribute to that. That's coming out probably early 2025, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here for our opening season of the 24-25. And thank you, Walt. You're so generous, and I always learn something about your approach.
I just want to encourage all your watchers and listeners, feel free to reach out to me on my website. I love answering questions. I love this work. I love the engagement with different communities like your community, Kari. So thanks so much for having me on here.
Thank you. And everyone, our next NATS chat will be 1 week earlier than normal, November 3rd. And my co-host Ian Howell and I will discuss the tax landscape for independent voice teachers with a CPA, Elaine Grogan-Luttrell. So I hope you'll join us on November 3rd to get some the nuts and bolts about the business of running a studio. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, Walt.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.